And we're super excited to welcome back one of our absolute favorite speakers at the Institute, which is James Dotson. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with James, but just in case you're not, I'm going to quickly read his bio for you. Sorry, James. Let me just find it because I didn't pull it up because I wasn't prepared as usual. We will be recording this talk just so everybody knows. So if you, oh, we are actively recording this talk. Thanks, Vanetta. So if you don't want to be on, recorded in any way, just feel free to turn off your camera. It's not, well, actually it might be public. So yeah, if you're shy, turn off your camera, no problem. So just super quick bio for James, just so you know who we're talking to today. J.W. Dotson, MD, is a psychiatrist with a fascination for the strange borderlands of fragrance. His interests include ethnobotany, alchemy, classical astrology, and archaic and traditional medicine. He has been a perfume blogger at Sniffapalooza magazine and is the first recipient of the Now Smell This Le Prix au Faux Award in 2008. James has a website. James, what is your domain again?
It will be on my first
uncannysense.com.
Yeah, and so I'll reference it on my first slide.
Okay, super. So that's James' website if anybody's curious about checking out his work. And I think without further ado, let's stretch out and get ready for a wild ride in the world of chromosmology with James. If you have any questions, pop them in the chat. There will be, moments where he'll answer them. Yeah, that's without further ado, James, I think you're up, my friend.
Thanks. Okay, well, we'll thank you for Saskia for doing the slides because they had like a Google Chrome weirdness. So she's helping me today. Without further ado, I guess we'll jump into the first slide. Like I said, I put my alarm for about a half hour. I will try to answer some questions midway through, but mostly would answer questions later on. But if something pops into your head, putting it in the chat is a good idea. Uh-oh, what was that? All right, so I thought that was me. So the topic today is color and perfume and the sort of metaphysical correlations and interactions of the two. The title is Chromosmology, and this is a word which you may not have heard of because I made it up. It's a neologism. So chrome means color, and osmology is like kind of an archaic word for the study of smells. So it basically implies it's the study of both color and smell at the same time. And I like it because it has this very 19th century kind of like crazy science vibe to it. And this entire talk will have that entire mad scientist kind of approach to things. So something that's different this time, I have spoken before, and you can see my videos on the website. I've underlined here the website. This time I actually have added some material pertaining to color and smell on the website. A lot of it are detailed things that I just don't have time to talk about, and some of them are actually some reproductions from books and things that you can look at. I have a particular essay on violet, which is all about the color violet and the smell violet. That kind of dives deep into the correlations of those. So you can look at Uncanny Sense. I'll probably reference it when there's something we're going past where there's more material for you guys to look at. These corners, I'll be talking about this. This is sort of a little teaser. These corners are from a 1902 book, which shows the correlations between colors in the aura and different kinds of feelings and emotions. And this is incredibly influential on a lot of artists and creative people. And I'm going to be talking about this because it definitely ties in with both color and smell. So next slide, thank you. Okay, so I just want to acknowledge, if you see this book to the right, this is a color theory book, and which is quite good. But I wanted to acknowledge that the world of color is a gigantic world, and color theory is extremely complex. It's really diverse. It covers multiple fields. It's really fascinating. I've only mentioned a few of the things in which there's a lot of writing. There's like science, the arts, music, literature, history, philosophy, psychology, culture, et cetera, et cetera. I actually realized I forgot to put architecture. I meant to do that too, but it just goes on and on. So all these different fields have something to contribute to the whole theories about color. And there's no like universal codification of what colors mean, which I find really fascinating. There's lots of diverse ideas about it, and I'll be talking about those, but a lot of these different fields do play into what I'm going to be talking about today. Um, and so, just keep that in the back of your mind. So scent, I wanted to kind of give you guys an idea about how I'll be approaching fragrance, because this is just something that I generally give at the beginning of my talk. So we are at the Institute for Art and Olfaction. So clearly we see fragrance as an art. I put hedonic first because the initial thing that draws us to fragrance is that we love it. It gives us pleasure and joy. I mean, simple things, just like making a cup of coffee in the morning. You have this delicious coffee, you're bringing it up, taking a sip, you're inhaling it. It's very simple, but the initial thing that draws you, I think, is the sense of joy. And also, of course, at the same time, it's an art. I wrote healing arts because this is my particular interest, as I feel that fragrance does have a lot of potential for healing. And in fact, in a lot of different cultural, spiritual, and other sorts of contexts, it does have healing functions, which I'm going to be talking about today. The other thing about fragrance is that it's this odd thing. People have described it as something between an object and idea, because it's this weird invisible something. So it's by its very nature, it's liminal. It lives between the visible and the invisible, and it naturally is sort of aligned with otherworldly things, which I'll talk about today. So I'm going to start with a quote from Baudelaire, one of my favorite 19th century poets, because this really encapsulates a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today. So the quote is, "Everything, form, movement, number, color, perfume, in the spiritual as well as the natural world is meaningful, reciprocal, converse, corresponding." So it's kind of a complicated quote, but I want to focus on is that basically he talks about color and perfume being correspondent. So there are correspondences, but also literally correspondent, like they talk to each other in a reciprocal way, that they communicate with each other. And he mentions that this is something both in a spiritual planes, beyond the reality that we can see, as well as in the natural world. Another theme, which I'll be bringing up, that I just put here to remind myself to talk about it, is a lot of what I'll be talking about is cosmology, which is this whole idea of like how the universe was created. And so a lot of these theories about color and fragrance go back to that. Some of them, of course, in the Western world are very Bible centric, but not always. But the whole idea is that when the universe was created, there was let there be light. There was light in the beginning, and there was also sound. And these things are intimately connected to the secrets of creation. And if you understand how these things happened, how colors and sounds and things were created, you could reproduce those as an artist or as a magician, actually. And you could use these correspondences in practical ways in order to impact the physical world. Okay, so next. So here's a couple just bullet points of things for you guys to kind of keep in the background, because I'll be bringing these sorts of things up and referencing them. Keeping in mind, I'm laughing because like each of these bullet points could be like an hour talk, but I just want to bring them up to bring them into our awareness. So first of all is synesthesia. So if you go to the Art and Olfaction website, there is a page that has references and digital copies of articles. There are several really good ones on synesthesia that you can look at. But basically, for people who aren't super familiar with that, it describes what people generally think of as a neurological condition, where in childhood, people have this plasticity where all the senses are kind of connected and they're all sort of pinging around in their brain. And later on, as they get older, these connections between the senses are lost. But for some extremely kind of fortunate or unusual people, or I would call them neurodiverse people, these things are retained, so that, for instance, when they see a color, they may have a certain sound associated with it as an involuntary thing, or they may see a certain shape in their head. And this does play into what I'm going to talk about, because is this crosstalk between senses. The actual synesthesia, where people connect smell with color, is actually extremely rare. All the synesthesias with smell are pretty uncommon. Of people currently, the one that pops into my head that people may know about who has this is Christopher Brosius, who's a perfumer with I Hate Perfume in New York. And in interviews, he has talked about this a bit, but it is something that he's had, for quite a while, and he talks about that. So one of the ideas about synesthesia is that it's this kind of neurological condition, but the fact is that's not entirely true, because people can experience these crosstalk between sensations during certain exceptional circumstances. Most notably, people found this out like during the 60s and 70s when they took hallucinogens, that they had synesthetic experiences. And certainly that is something that does add to this this kind of appeal, that people feel like they're retreating to what I call a lost ideal, where all the senses were all part of one package and they really weren't divided. There are some other cultural studies of cultures that use ayahuasca, for instance, where people have these incredible ayahuasca visions where all the senses are connected, that they're actually kind of fascinating, that refer to this. The other thing is a term that's more of an academic term, intersensoriality, which is just basically talking about how different senses interact. And a lot of these studies of the senses came out in the 90s, and then in the 80s, this very famous book came out by Alain Corbin called The Foul and the Fragrant. And then in the 90s, there's several other scholars like Klassen and Howe, who came out with these studies that were amongst the very first cultural studies of the senses and anthropological studies of the senses. And they do talk about some things where certain cultures do have this crosstalk between senses. It's actually kind of fascinating. Now, it's not impossible for people to have access to these, not just through being born with it or through, hallucinogens, but there are ways in which people can link them. And I mention a couple in here. The first one is there are exercises that people can do. And I know from someone who attended the IFF perfumery school that one of the exercises that they did at the time they were there is that the students would sit around a table. They were presented with a fragrant material, and then they were given, I think, watercolors to do a very quick watercolor sketch of the fragrance that they were smelling. And then they would compare them to the other person and kind of talk about like, well, why do I have so much blue with vetiver? Or why do I have these shapes? Or why do I have this spiky place? And this is an exercise that really gives people access to understanding how they experience the color by linking it with something that they've actually put on a piece of paper. The other thing is we've been really fortunate at the Institute of Art and Olfaction to have classes from John Beeble, who's a perfumer and a really good writer. And he has taught some exercises in the classes, which I believe he refers to as sensory linking, where there's this whole idea, it's a semantics kind of exercise where you struggle to link senses with fragrances. Like, why does this smell smooth or raspy, or why does it suggest a certain sound, a tone, or a color? And by doing this kind of praxis, this kind of experience, people can actually learn to develop these kind of connections between smell, color, and other senses. So I don't believe that you can't get some type of thing like synesthesia, even though it's not wired in people. Some other things just to throw out there. When I talk about colors, and especially the metaphysical qualities of colors, I want people to kind of think about what kind of qualities are suggested by a color and how might that be mirrored in a fragrance. So as an example, if someone tells you, oh, well, the mystical powers tell me that the color orange rules over citrus fragrances, which it does, surprise, surprise, there's kind of this interesting thing of like, well, why would the color orange suggest citrus? Well, there are certain commonalities, like the color orange not universally, but certainly in our Western societies, a lot of times people see it as sunny. It's a warm, kind of joyous color. And then there's this sort of cross association that can cross over to certain things that suggest that some, because they literally look orange, like oranges, but citruses have by association had that. So there is sort of this shared thing, which I'll talk about. And then finally, this is a giant topic, but I'm just touching on it. There's all this consumer studies of color, like why people prefer like a red car or whatever. And this does apply to perfume. This has to do like, why do they make angel blue, or why do they make an aquatic smell, you know, a certain color? These are interesting, and I'll touch on this a little. And a lot of this also goes into color symbolism, some of which, you know, I referred to in the last slide, is from studies of like psychology and myth and stuff like that. Okay, so this is a lot going on. So I will now sort of leap into this. Thanks. Okay, so now we have Saskia's very favorite person in the entire universe. She likes Septimus Peace so much that she named an award after Septimus Peace, who wrote this book in the 1850s called The Art of Perfumery. So the reason I'm talking about this is because I cannot really start in on talking about color and fragrances without talking about the very pesky problem of how you classify fragrances. So this has been an issue that's ongoing, and probably someone should give like a 3-hour lecture on it, but it's interesting. There are different ways of classifying fragrances. And this particular person had the fascinating idea of linking them up with the musical scale. So just to kind of backtrack a little, the 19th century really, to my mind, really makes me think of Victorian scientists who were crazy about taxonomies and classification. I always imagine them like going off to some jungle and gathering various orchids and butterflies, and then they bring them back to their museum in London, where they're of course dead, and they label them and put them in boxes. Of course, it's like some sign of like this horrible colonial oppression where they have to rape and pillage the forest and kill it and bring it back. But there was this passion of trying to put things in boxes. And frankly, fragrances are so like tricksy and ephemeral. It's kind of like ridiculous to try to put them in boxes, but nonetheless, it is something that people did. And he had this idea about putting things on with the musical scale. So if you look to the right, you can see part of this. Now, what's interesting is there's something called the law of octaves. And this isn't really a musical thing. This is something in chemistry. And I'm going to talk to you about this. But in chemistry, there was something called the law of octaves on the periodical table, where if you went up in the weight of the elements, every eighth element would be very similar, kind of like when you go up in the scale, every eighth note is very similar. So people who were mystically inclined thought the universe was built on octaves, like, oh, look, God made the elements by octaves, and then God made the Western scale of music exactly like that too. And so this heptatonic scale, which means 7, was something that was very important to people who are interested in these mystical qualities. So the reason for that is this whole divine idea that things were made in 7s. So if you go to the YouTube channel for IAO, you'll see that I did this whole talk on the 7 sense. So 7s are, you know, they predate the Bible, but in the Bible, of course, there's the 7 days of creation. We have the 7 days of the week. There's all kinds of 7s in there. So if you can recall when you were in school and you learned about Newton, I think most of us had some sort of lesson where you learned about Newton discovering gravity, and then you had the prism, where the prism makes the pretty rainbow. And then you're taught the 7 colors, which is totally crazy because, like, what is indigo? Like, why are there 7 colors? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. But Newton was obsessed by making everything a 7 because he was also an alchemist, and alchemy is very, very fixated on like these 7 metals, 7 planets. He was also really into all kinds of stuff like studying the pyramids and Bible prophecies and the whole book of Revelations, which is nothing but like 7 seals, 7 spirits, and so on. So he made it so that there would be 7 colors in the rainbow. And of course, now you see the pictures of the rainbow with 6 or sometimes 5. So it's not canonical, but it is Newton was just obsessed with these sevens, which, oh, look, it matches these 7 scales here. And so this will be important later because the 7 colors, which they refer to as the 7 rays, were kind of linked up with both sounds and with perfumes. So all of the 19th century was focused on this pre-modern physics. Part of it is what's called ether physics, where there was a substance called ether, which is this kind of all-pervading earth stuff, which was everywhere in the universe, and it was vibrating. And they felt that these vibrations were what created light, sound, and also fragrance. Like fragrance is constantly referred to as a vibration in the 19th century. Also, there's a lot of stuff in mathematics about the 4th dimension that entered the popular consciousness, which was really fascinating to people because they're like, oh, look, now we have a reason to explain ghosts because they're in the 4th dimension. Or, you know, oh, now I understand these strange things like radio waves. That's why we have telepathy. So all of these sorts of technical innovations were fascinating to people because they really felt that they might explain kind of supernatural things. And so I say strange forces haunt the arts. So a lot of artists and creative people were really interested in this and really kind of incorporated this into their art, this idea that there was all these vibrations and mystical things floating out there that most people couldn't be aware of. So the people who were aware of it in the last bullet point are people that were highly strung or sensitive. So there was started to be this idea that maybe electricity worked in people's brains and nervous systems. This was, you know, understood to a certain degree. And so they felt that, you know, medical and scientific people felt that some people, their nerves were overly sensitive to things, and they were, you know, people were described as highly strung. The word sensitive was also used for people who were psychic, who could perceive things that other people couldn't. And these kinds of descriptors were also, of course, used with artists. And then there was this whole negative connotation to it because, of course, it's women who are normally passive and sensitive. So this is considered kind of pathological to a certain extent. And that's, you know, the romantic artist kind of stereotype of them being kind of perversely oversensitive started. But this is something that I'll talk about in a minute, about sensitives who are able to sense these things that other people can't. Okay, next. Okay, so now here's an example of someone who just brought all this together into their art. So I'm going to very briefly talk about music, and I beg you, I am not a musicologist, so if I make a really stupid mistake, please put something in the chat and correct me, because it's not my thing. But Scriabin was a Russian composer. He was a theosophist. I will talk about theosophy in a while, but he was basically this intense mystic who was obsessed with all these correspondences between color and music, and it entered into his compositions, not just because he thought it was fascinating, but he literally thought that when he was playing the music that it would create a change in the world, like a magical spell that would do something. So his composition Prometheus from 1910 was actually made for a chromola, which are these color organs. So they had these things that had music and also had colored lights. And there were some other musicians that used this, and, you know, after his death, they did try to do some performances using light and music, but he really felt like this was actually crucial. These colors here actually show his correspondences. Some people think he was a synesthete, and I don't really know. I think maybe this was just based on his spiritual investigations about why he thought a particular color had a note. Now, so bringing it up to now, so he had this composition that he never finished called Mysterium. That was like incredibly grandiose. It could only be performed in the Himalayas. It was going to take a week, and it also had the art of perfume. So there would be music, color. There's also some performance and dance, and incense and perfume. So as to honor him, his death was in 1915. So on his 100th anniversary, there was a centennial, and they performed Scriabin in the Himalayas, where somehow they dragged this piano up to some top of some mountain in the Himalayas and had this performance. And the French perfumer Michel Kounitska created a special fragrance for this, which they they used during the performance. Apparently it was an incense-based thing. So this is an example of like a total performance, but it's not just art for art's sakes, because he actually felt that it would create a change in the world. In some descriptions, it almost sounds like this Ragnarok thing where the entire world would be remade. But this is an example of someone who's deeply into all these things. And he did want to do fragrance, but it didn't happen before he died. Okay, next one. So, okay, so here to the right is what kind of got me really into this. Now, when we did live talks at Chinatown back in the day, I did an esoteric aromatherapy, and I did go talk about this briefly, but I didn't really have time to go into it deeply. So we're in the 1960s now, and I can give you an example of people who were incorporating all these things. So this is like a little piece of detective work, and I will talk to you about where I found it. But there was a book, which I will mention shortly, that came out about 4 years ago that was all talking about all kinds of metaphysical color things. And they made some reference to this group in the 60s. I was able to find a scan of this magazine called Chimes. So Chimes was a spiritualist magazine. It was printed in Orange County, but it covered the entire United States. And it had listings for spiritualist churches and services and other kinds of new agey things. And this ad appeared in it, which I'm going to go through and point out some interesting things. Okay, so the bottom of it says that it's for the Aquarian Cosmic Colour Fellowship. It's in Hollywood. If you look at the top, it's on Taft Avenue. I Google mapped this. It's like in some little residential area off of Franklin. So this is not like a giant temple. We're talking about like a little cottage or something, which they use for spiritualist services. You'll see at the top the name of the reverends who are there. And then there's a description about colors and how they affect you. There's a particular thing about mail order lessons, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the thing that really caught my eye was right in the center, where it describes Thursday evenings. And tonight is a Thursday evening too. So I don't know if this is a coincidence or maybe meaningful. But on Thursday evenings, you could go to a Radiant Life Harmonics, an evening dedicated to the Garden of the Soul, featuring a symphony of color, music, perfume, and incense, followed by a trance lecture on the science of color. So apparently they placed you in this entire immersive thing where they probably played some sort of record of classical music. I doubt that it was live. But they also must probably had colored lights, and then they had perfume and incense as well, which, as we'll see, would correspond to the colors they're using. And then they had a trance lecture, which is like what we talk about now as channeling, basically. And then on Fridays, they had what's called a problem clinic. Notice the word clinic. So they did focus on healing, and I'll talk about that a little bit. So the idea was that colors and fragrances had a healing function, and they would employ those to help people with their problems. Then third Sunday, they had this message service where they would have classes in healing, psychic science, unfoldment is like psychic development, and they would have all these other kinds of spiritualist stuff. They could do an aura analysis, and they could do numerology and so on. As I'll explain later, there was this reading they would do where they would find your life colors, and then they would match that up with specific fragrances, so they could find like your soul fragrance, which would be a fragrance which would help you like on your life path. So a couple of things that are important in this. I mentioned the channel lecture. So I will talk about spiritualism in a little while. So this was like the very tail end of the spiritualist movement in the early 60s. There were a fair number of small spiritualist churches in California. They did network a lot. And so a lot of times the reverends would go from one town to another giving lectures. A lot of this was to avoid LAPD, because Johnny 5-0 was always getting in the business of like psychics and spiritualists and people who did any kind of thing like that. But if you were a reverend, they basically would leave you alone. So this is interesting. Down in the lower corner, I have a still from this 1940s movie called The Amazing Mr. X that's about a spiritualist. And there was a lot of negative connotations that, people thought this is about some spiritualist that tries to con some woman out of her money. So there's some negative connotations about, spiritualism as well. Okay, so next, here's another ad. I found this in Fate magazine, and again in 1961. So they offered these lessons, mail order lessons, and this was a typical way to teach stuff like that then, that people would have a mail order, like all these mystical organizations like the Rosicrucians and so on would send you these mail order lessons that you would read like once a week, once every couple weeks. And then generally, as we'll see, they would also offer doing like aura readings and things like that to customize them for you. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so this book to the right is the one in which I'm really going to tell you like where a lot of this material is that I found. So, so up on the corner with the pink arrow, you will see, this is the reason why I know about this. We will blame Mandy Aftel for my bibliomania. But so approximately 20 years ago, Mandy's book came out, Essence and Alchemy, which you haven't read it. It's amazing, but it really was this pioneering book in natural perfumery and basically an artisan and indie perfumery. But I was kind of obsessed by the bibliography because she had this crazy book collection, a lot of very scarce, rare books that I hadn't heard of before. And this one was mentioned. And of course, so I had to track it down, and I found it, some time ago. And I've always been really interested in it, but just in the last year, I was looking at it again because I found some more information that kind of unpacked it for me. What's interesting is that this was 1937. They used the term aromo-therapy, and this is probably the first mention in English of this. They're also in 37 in France. This is where the term aromatherapy came by probably, it's Gattefossé, I think. But this is interesting. They also used it to kind of go with the other therapies they're doing. This book at the bottom says it's a symphony of color, sound, perfume, and it basically shows how you correspond all three of these to like do mystical treatments for people. The person who wrote this, not a lot is known about him. His name is Roland Hunt. He was British. He apparently was trained as a musician. And he studied with this person I will be talking about in a minute, Iva Berg Witten, who was this master of color, but she didn't write a lot. And he mentions her in this. She's sort of a shadowy figure in it. And he taught a lot about color, and then he didn't actually move from Britain to California until the 40s. And then he taught and was in Hollywood, and then later like in Santa Barbara and I think in Ojai. But what's really important is he did experiments with the perfumer Prince Matchabelli, which I'm going to be talking about, which have been able to kind of tease out some more information. And, the Prince apparently supplied these perfume materials to do these experiments and like using fragrances in influencing people. So this book to the left, this book, I'm sorry, the 37 book was like really only reprinted once. It became really rare and scarce, but his other color books, like this one to the left, got reprinted a lot and were reprinted in the 70s because there was this whole psychedelic revival of interest in color stuff. Okay, next. So Rainbow Body, if you guys are like obsessed by like chakras and colors and stuff, this book has a lot of material, and he talks somewhat about what I've told you. I just wanted to like give a shout out to this person, and it's on the website, my website too. Okay, next. Okay, so Iva Berg Witten. So she's kind of a mystery person. She's really interesting. To the right is the insignia of her organization, Amica Aquarian Mystical Institute of Color Awareness. So as best as I can figure out, she was from the East Coast. She was trained as an artist. She became very interested in mystical things, and like around before 1905, I believe, she became very interested in Theosophy, which I will be talking about. She attended some lectures that had to do with auras and colors and thought forms, and she became very fascinated. And this led to her eventually deciding that that was going to be her life work. The story is that she became very ill, and she had a near-death experience in the hospital back east, and that when she was about to die, this mysterious stranger came to her and said, you can either die now or you can do your life work, which is going to be color. And as I will discuss, this was supposed to be probably this ascended master, Saint Germain, because Iva belonged to the violet ray. Hold on. Okay, I'll answer questions in a second. So Iva belonged to this violet ray, and this was her mystical teacher, this ascended master. So I just wanted to give this one quote about perfume because I'm going to talk about this a little more. So she says, perfume of many kinds lie essentially within a determined group of cosmic vibrations. So again, they're always about vibrations. But what's interesting is they are a specialization of life energy from the sun, which have a definite effect upon the olfactory organs. So this is interesting and very poetic, but there was an idea that fragrances were essentially crystallized light, like light manifesting in the world eventually stepped down and became perfumes. And I will talk about this a little bit more. So I'm almost at the point where I said I would answer questions. Was there anything that people were dying to know? I didn't really look at the chat. You just listed stuff. Is there anything?
I think, I don't know. I don't see, I mean, I think probably people are a little enraptured. So I don't see any particular questions yet. Manetta's been sharing links and yeah. So I think we can continue unless anybody has any burning.
No, trying to be cognizant of time. Okay, let's go.
Very, very considerate. Okay, let me reshare.
Okay.
1 second. There we go.
Okay, so Iva, again, she was an artist. She was known for doing aura paintings and stuff. She relocated to Hollywood in the 30s and was very active. But like I said, she didn't really write that much. She had a lot of students, and this other student did most of her writing. But I will be talking about her a little bit more. So next slide. Okay. So this comes from this book, Rainbow Body, where he just pulled out a lot of stuff from the book and put it into this nice kind of spreadsheet for us. Now, I do have this on the website so that you can stare at it and study it and try to figure it out. But basically, I'm just going to focus more on the perfumes and the rays, which are the colors. So there are a lot of perfumes for each color, but they had a couple that they thought were like primary perfumes. And as I will discuss, they realized that there were some differences, that different people had slightly different opinions about which color perfumes were assigned to. And they were willing to accept that a fragrance may have several different colors associated with it, as I'll talk to you about, but they often looked at what was the dominant color that came up for them. And Iva was considered this master clairvoyant. So they kind of went from her, and she's the one who came up with these perfumes. I really can't find that she got them from anyone else. There's no one before her that I can think that she borrowed them from. This other stuff to the right we'll ignore because it comes from other kinds of the gemstones and stuff seem totally not to make sense, but they're from other Theosophists and stuff like that. But just to look from the top, for instance, violet, as I discuss on my website, is shockingly associated with the color violet. If we bump down to the very bottom, the red ray is associated with rose, and then orange is associated with oriental lily, which would be, they didn't have stargazers then, but it would be like a heavy, lily fragrance, which would, be kind of like the spicy white floral. And then, yellow is jasmine. You can go through here. You get rose twice here because you can see that tea rose is actually showing up as green, which is interesting because they do acknowledge that certain fragrances have multiple different colors. And as I will discuss in a second with the next slide, I think people who are perfume people are aware of this, but when people try to classify things like rose, it's kind of ridiculous because it's not simply a rosy fragrance. If you've ever grown roses, there are roses that smell like raspberries. There's roses that have citrus nuances. There's spicy roses. There's, roses that smell kind of musky. So there's all different types of sub notes in roses. And you go up here to lilac and lily of the valley. Now, if you're a perfume person, you will immediately notice something. This is the 1930s. So There is no like natural lily of the valley. This is definitely something that they got that was a perfume base, which probably had some naturals mixed with synthetics. And I'll be talking about that a little bit. They probably got these from Prince Matchabelli. And the same with lilac. I mean, once upon a time in the ancient days, they did some enfleurage and other solvent extractions and stuff, but these were primarily like synthetics probably. So they particularly do reference this, and I will go into some detail, but they clairvoyantly observed synthetic fragrances, and they did not say that they were bad. They said that they were different. In some cases, the colors were a little harsher or rougher, but they did apparently use them. Also, they used a lot of fresh flowers. So sometimes the roses may refer to the fact that they were in California and they were going out to the garden and using fresh roses for specific purposes. Okay, next. So this again, thank you to Saskia. I know she put this on Instagram and I put it somewhere on Facebook. There's a lot going on here. I could probably spend like 15 minutes, but I will just, for the sake of time, I will go over it a little bit because people are interested in it. So this is from the book, and apparently this is based on their clairvoyant observation of different fragrances and trying to peg them into different colors. So, and they go up the scales because they recognize that, you know, there's, like we saw in Septimus Peace, there's like octaves and there's different types of colors or different tones of color may be associated with something. So, oh, thank you, Minetta. So at the top here, so I'll just start with the top because it's kind of interesting. So the top, for red, we see it's patchouli, there's sandalwood, which is interesting, and I will be talking a lot about sandalwood because this is something that was discussed a lot by Theosophists. This one always shows up as red and has this whole association with the red ray and the spiritual master, Moria, who's associated with the red ray. So I'll talk about that a little bit later, but also sandalwood was a dual color one. Other people saw other colors with it. Next is geranium. So rose geranium, this is what it means, was also thought to be on the red ray. And then they have the specific rose that's like some sort of rose, like some antique rose. I have no idea what it is. I haven't figured it out. If you pop down to the next one, you can also see they list another rose called La France, which is a hybrid rose, I believe. They have camphor, which is odd. And then they have yet another rose here, which was like this Merchel rose, which was some sort of noisette rose, which was kind of this raspberry scented rose. So they're crazy about roses. So when they're talking about red, I will interject that they had some specific ideas about different tones of red. The general idea is the more lighter ethereal colors, like the pinks were more ethereal and spiritual, and the darker colors were a little bit more coarse. They specifically mentioned things like geranium and rosewood were a little bit darker, whereas the roses, of course, are more towards the pink end of the spectrum. And I'll be talking about them specific meanings they associated with pink shortly. And then looking at the very bottom, for instance, of course, violet has violets. And then they have this word orone, which I think is just a typo for eonone. They also saw that mints and peppermint, which are kind of cool, were also associated with violets. I will talk a little bit about the cold hot thing, but I think a lot of us know that there's some kind of association with the spectrum where warm colors like reds and oranges are sometimes associated with warmer scents, like more spicy things, and cool spectrum things like blue violets sometimes are associated with cooler things. And that's something that they found to be true sort of clairvoyantly. So just as an example, and then we'll move on to the next slide. So like what should they do with this? So I talked to you about this problem clinic where it looks like you would go see the spiritualist and they would address your problem. So as an example, they did physical healing for people who had physical problems, but a lot of times there were like life problems or psychosocial problems. For instance, just an example, imagine that you're going to see the spiritualist medium, and you basically went in there saying, I'm just really unhappy, I don't know what's wrong, I hate my job. And then they might do some sort of spiritual reading of your aura and tell you, well, you're not really doing your life work and you're blocked. And then they would ask the person what they loved, and they would say, oh, well, I love to make hats for my friend, I wish I could do that. And then they would come up with some sort of way to prescribe for that person to do what they sometimes call character development, which is to kind of like overcome a person's problem. So they might say, oh, you need orange because orange is really good for being social. And when you're going to be social and bright and sunny, you'll meet people and your business will take off. So we will treat you with orange. And I'll talk about this, in a short time too, but they would do treatments with orange, which literally means like they would give you orange light. Sometimes they would have you eat orange foods. You would eat a bunch of carrots and oranges and yams and things. And they would use orange fragrances, which, as I said, were often things like bergamot and citrus fragrances. And this could be part of this whole treatment to put you like in an orange vibration and to make you, more socially active and to allow you to pursue like your career dreams and stuff. Okay, so next. Okay, so this is great. I love this thing, the Color-Solarizing Fragrance-Fan, which I advertised as being something I talk about. So this is in one of their books. And it's one of the rare ones where they give you a super specific way in which they treated people. This way, they treated people with both color and fragrance at the same time. It's a very fascinating thing that was like an environmental fragrancing kind of do-it-yourself with some color. What it is basically is, I'll read it, but they basically had this really sheer fabric that was colored. And if you held it up to the light, a colored light would shine upon your face. And if you waved it around, because it was filled with this potpourri, you would also get a fragrance. So it says, this is an appealing accessory for those in the invalid rooms. They're made out of organdy, which is this incredibly sheer, stiff fabric, which Saskia can probably tell us more about, which is stretched and doubled over a light frame, which finishes in a practical handle. In between the thickness of organdy, potpourri of flower petals is loosely filled. Organdy of various colors and potpourri of different ray flowers are used. When on the terrace or near a sunny window, the patient holds the color fan screen between her face and the sun and wafts the cooling, fragrant air towards her, enjoying a combined color fragrance tonic. And then they use an example. The violet organdy would be filled with potpourri of sweet violets as a way of taking, they call it viola gas, which is this terrible compound word, which basically means a perfume. And they use the word gas for something that's like, delivered by the air, a perfume that is associated with violet. But so you see here, this is kind of this really cool do-it-yourself, wave this thing around, you get some fragrance, and then you get the colored light, which is important. I didn't really reference this, but I will. California is very important as this place where this is happening, because a lot of these people felt like they needed to be someplace where there's a lot of sunlight, because the natural sunlight and the colors coming through windows and naturally colored glass was considered superior to artificial lights. And so a lot of times, a lot of these people ended up in Southern California or in someplace else that was sunny, like Australia or, Florida or something like that. So the whole idea of like the sun also was rather important in this. Okay, next. Okay, just looking at my time. So I'm now going to turn back the clock and give you some things that kind of give us a basis of like where some of the stuff comes from so that it makes a little bit more sense. So dialing back the clock to late 18th, early 19th century, there was the development of something called mesmerism, which people are probably just familiar with from like fantasy, sci-fi, like steampunk shows, but it was like a proto-hypnotism where people felt like there was this strange magnetic fluid that a person who would magnetize people and put them into a trance. What's important is that it became this huge craze, like in Europe, especially like in Victorian England, where they would have these like things in people's homes with almost like a parlor show where they would hypnotize the maid and put her into this mesmeric trance. And then in trance, people would do a lot of unusual things. They would often have this thing called a lucidity state where they would speak about things they shouldn't know about. They could see things at a distance. So they had like clairvoyance and all these other powers. And out of this, there was a particular person who did research, the Baron von Reichenbach, or Rickenbach, I'm not sure, Reichenbach, who believed that there was this force called the Odic force. It was named after Odin, and he felt that there were these auras around people. So this is a lot where we get the idea of auras. And people, when they were in trance, could see these weird colored flames around people. And this is one of the first mentions in the West of people seeing auras. Also, sometimes people in trance said they could smell the flames, so they had an actual fragrance coming off of them, which is kind of interesting. So mesmerism is key because it's what really led to spiritualism and, later to a lot of things involving trance, which we'll talk about because they're kind of cogent to the fragrance thing. Okay, next. Okay, so chromotherapy is the basis of a lot of this. So in the 19th century, there was a medical movement called chromotherapy, which means what it sounds like. They used colors in a therapeutic way to heal people. And so there were doctors who were really very interested in this. Keep in mind that science and spiritual things were really kind of blurred then. There wasn't the division that we have now. Medicine was very heterodox. It wasn't really codified. Like medical school and a lot of the medical things that we're used to weren't really codified amazingly till the early 20th century. So doctors oftentimes did what we would call alternative or integrative treatments mixed in with more standard drug treatments. And colored light became super trendy. In 1878, this book came out by Dr. Babbitt called The Principles of Light and Color. It's still in print. It's still in print, and I will discuss this a bit more, like I sort of do at the bottom of the page. But this interest in this color stuff persisted mostly in other countries. It got really adopted in India and became very popular there. It then had this resurgence again in the 20s and 30s, which is an influence on these mystical people, Witten and Hunt. Now, the doctors weren't super mystical. They just thought that there was some physical property in light that would do all kinds of things. It would cure you of medical conditions. If you use yellow light, it would cure you of constipation. They had all these things like that. And there was some legit stuff, like some sort of skin treatments with things that were more or less like ultraviolet light. So this sort of pooped down in the 30s. But then it was revived in the 70s, basically because during the hippie psychedelic revival, there was this immense publishing surge where they reprinted a lot of stuff that was kind of mystical, New Age, UFOs, ghosts, all that kind of stuff. It all got reprinted in the 70s. And there was a brief interest in it. And then it kind of pooped out in the United States. There's still some remnants of it. And if you're from LA, there's a place in Topanga called the Inn of the Seventh Ray, which is definitely this total hippie thing named after the seventh ray, which is the violet ray. But these things remain really powerful in esoteric traditions outside the United States. I won't talk too much about spiritualism, but the whole idea that you can talk to the dead started in the late 1840s, going into the 50s. And then split off and went all over the world. It became very, very prominent in South America and Mexico. And still exists as a sort of division of spiritualism called Espiritismo, which is huge in Cuba and Puerto Rico and in South America. And they are still seem to be very into these divisions of seven. They have these seven lines that are very big, and they also do a lot of color stuff. Nowadays, New Age people, I think mostly colors are associated with chakras, like the energy centers in your body. And also, I think crystals are really crazy popular now. So colors are associated mostly with crystals and stuff. But the heyday of color stuff was really in the 70s. Okay, next. Okay, so we have to talk about Theosophy, and I'm going to give you a little brief thing about Madame Blavatsky, because she really was the key in pushing forward some of this obscure kind of color fragrance theory. So she was this larger than life character. There's multiple biographies of her. She was Russian from an aristocratic family. She had this marriage of convenience and dumped her husband. And then she was like this adventurous who traveled all over the world, like everywhere, like all these crazy remote places, if you can believe everything that she said. But she was very interested and studied with a lot of sort of mystical occult people. She became a very, very famous spiritualist medium. But then she decided that she was done with spiritualism, and she was really interested in promoting something that was more than that. And in 1875, she founded the Theosophical Society. I detail this a little bit more on the website, but she wanted to have this whole synthesis of like occult stuff from the Renaissance with like Indian and Buddhist doctrines, and really teach people about these. It was immensely, hugely popular. It spread all over the world, probably mostly up until the 1930s when it kind of petered out, but it was everywhere. And it's kind of hard to explain just how influential it was, because it promoted for the very first time to anyone in the West things about like yoga, Hinduism, Buddhism, and almost all Theosophists were very progressive. I mean, they were vegetarians, they're into animal rights, they were suffragettes. They had a lot of anti-colonialist kind of sentiments. And in addition to that, I will reference this too, their books became very popular later on with sci-fi and fantasy writers, and ultimately in the 20th century with comic book writers, because one of the central tenets is that there's a new kind of mutated humanity developing who will have psychic powers, which is totally like something from like X-Men or superpowered, individuals in comic books. But she wrote about this, and in particular said that there'd be places where these people would emerge. And she referenced California as being one of the main ones, also Australia. So just hugely important as far as a lot of these ideas, and hugely important with a lot of artists, as I'll show you in a sec. Her big book was The Secret Doctrine, this massive book. And she also wrote something called Isis Unveiled. So these books were very important. It's a huge thing. It really took off. And she had an inner group of people that she taught. So there's some things she didn't even write about. It was totally like mouth to ear, oral transmission. She had an inner group of students. And in that inner group, there was like even more of an inner group of 12 people. Those are the people she specifically taught about color stuff. And she had specific ideas about the meaning of the 7 colors, which she called the 7 rays. And I will give you a couple little quotes in a minute. She never really meant this to be published, but when she died, her successor, Annie Besant, decided she was going to just go ahead and publish this. And it did come out as this thing called Volume 3 of the Secret Doctrine. And this is where a lot of the stuff about the 7 rays started. And then it became kind of like a big deal in the early 20th century with kind of spiritual, quasi-theosophical people. So her successors, there were several successors, but the main ones are these 2 people, Besant and Ledbetter. They were both clairvoyants, and they did a lot of investigations involving clairvoyant things and colors. So the next slide will take us into that. So here's a little mini slide that just shows where visible light is. So as you can see, it's this incredibly narrow part of the spectrum. So again, going back to sort of all the spooky science and so on, by the 1890s, people knew about radio waves, and there was X-rays, and people really realized that there was this entire invisible world around them. And this was a focus for a lot of these people, because it was like a vindication that the invisible world was real and that it explained a lot of these psychic things. So next. All right, so this is kind of has a lot of quotes in it, but this is basically something that kind of talks about the whole idea of fragrances, and it doesn't directly address fragrances, but it will. But it basically talks about how everything comes from the sun and from light and is a form of vibration. So this thing on the right is like a little diagram where you can see the sun splitting into these 7 spirits before the throne, which is a reference in the Bible, which are the 7 colors. And she says, he is 1 in 7, and on the cosmic plane is behind all such manifestations as light, heat, sound, adhesion, and as a spirit of electricity. So what she's talking about is something that is actually animism, where in the past, when we've discussed this, animism refers to how everything is alive, like plants and animals and rocks and everything are alive. But she also felt that physical phenomena such as electricity and magnetism were alive. Like there were actually sort of like plasma creatures living in there. Again, this is something that later sci-fi people definitely took from her. So she felt that actually there were life forms and electricity. Esoteric science teaches that every sound in the visible world awakens its corresponding sound in the invisible realms and arouses to action some force or other on the occult side of nature. Moreover, every sound corresponds to a color and a number, a potency, spiritual, psychic, or physical, and to a sensation on some other plane. It's an indirect reference to other sensations like smell. All these find an echo in every one of the developed elements, and even on the terrestrial plane, in the lives that swarm in the terrene atmosphere, thus prompting them to action. So this is like a really theosophical, it's difficult to understand, but basically what she's talking about is that the sun is this force, and that one of the ways that people can work with it is by using sound and color. I think people are familiar, if you do yoga class, about doing mantras like Om and such. She felt like, using sounds and mantras would influence the invisible world. Using colors can also influence it. And it influences these invisible lives, which I'll talk about in a minute. So there were spirits that lived in these colors, which are sometimes they're manifestations of natural forces. They're sometimes called elementals. They particularly refer them to as devas. So deva is a Sanskrit word. It means like a shining Holy Spirit. The Theosophists usually use them to refer to these kind of semi-angelic beings, though frankly, they're a little bit more like fairies or jinn. That controlled like natural forces in the world. And she felt that like colors and sounds, and as we'll later see also fragrances, somehow actually interacted with them. So next slide. Okay, so this is a quote from Witten. This is from the book, the Roland Hunt book. So you're correct. Deva is male and Devi is female, but the Theosophists misused a lot of Sanskrit words, so they kind of gave their own meaning to it. So she, Witten is, as we recall, she was this amazing clairvoyant. And there's this whole talk about how she apparently, besides being a violet ray person, her whole thing is that she had an unusual association with these spirits, these non-human spirits. It was part of her life path to work with them. And some of the other people like Roland Hunt said they thought she wasn't even quite human because she was so unusual. In this place, she describes one of these spirits in the center paragraph, in which she says, "I can best describe a quiver of one or more colors, a sort of shimmer, seeming to emanate from the wings, the skin and hair, and finally from its garments. Simultaneously, a blend of exquisite perfumes and soft, faint music steal upon the awareness." So not only does she see them as this shimmering, shining light, but they also have a beautiful music and an exquisite perfume associated with them, because she can perceive all three of these at once. This artistic representation is is on my website. It's by another theosophical writer, and the artist that worked with him, his name was Jeffrey Hudson. But this is pretty much, the sort of thing that she, would describe. So next slide. So to sort of backtrack a little to understand what these things are, this is a book that came out in 1902, which was incredibly influential on Witten. And she apparently saw Ledbetter, who's the writer, do the original lectures and show these big slides to like a crowd of people in an auditorium. And this was like one of these like aha moments for her when she decided she was really absolutely fascinated by color. So this book came out in 1902, and it had these color plates to the left, which it's really hard to read, but basically the colors are associated with meanings emotions, and so on. For instance, the pink one is associated with love or affection. So as an example, if you were to clairvoyantly look at someone's aura and you saw a bunch of pink, you would say like, oh, well, you're in love, because this shows that you're really experiencing love. And then this is kind of fascinating because there's a crossover in our language where we talk about someone in love is looking through rose-colored glasses, or they have a rosy outlook. I mean, they literally thought that you had so much pink in your aura that you were like seeing through pink light, which in turn puts you in this mood of pink, which is very uplifted and loving. This is one of the first things that really addressed colors having an abstract meaning. This became really important for a lot of artists and musicians. I mentioned Kandinsky. I'm mentioning Kandinsky here, who wrote this book, The Spiritual in Art, and there's a bunch of other abstract artists, musicians like Scriabin and writers and so on. He became obsessed with this and really fascinated that they could represent things abstractly. Okay, so the next slide. Okay, so he also wrote this book called Thought Forms. So this is a little bit more elaborate and is not necessarily about auras around people. These are things he sees when collective people have thoughts or when individual people have thoughts. This, you can't see it, it's cut off in the bottom, but it's supposed to be some sort of cathedral where they're playing Wagner. So the music of Wagner creates this three-dimensional cloud of color, which the artist is representing not only with colors, but with shapes. So this, it's 1901. I mean, it kind of looks like an abstract piece of art. Again, this book was really, really influential on a lot of artists because he had this whole idea that he could represent these. Now, spoiler, you may think like, oh, well, it's too bad he didn't look at perfumes and do like a painting like this. Well, he never had an artist do them, but in fact, he did clairvoyantly observe incenses and essential oils and had particular observations, which I'll be talking about in a second. So next. So this is sort of just a side note if you want to know more. So I was living in LA in the 80s. There was this insane, incredible exhibit in 86 at LACMA called the Spiritual in Art. This catalog still exists. It was an amazing show. So Hilma Klint, I'm glad that Saskia loves her. So she's an example of an artist, a Swedish artist who was active in the late 1800s. She was an ardent spiritualist and a theosophist. She was trained as an artist in Sweden and did these beautiful like botanical prints and stuff. But she became very influenced by all these ideas, which I've shown you. And she eventually would do these things where she would go into trances and the spirits would paint these abstract shapes. She did not really show them. And when she died in the 40s, her work was just absolutely not shown until this show in LA. I remember seeing these massive canvases and thinking like, why did I never learn about this person? Because no one knew about her. So I don't think that people really appreciated her that much in the show, but last year, the Guggenheim, it had like one of the highest attendances ever, because there's just something, I think people are really finding it fascinating because she probably was the first abstract artist. She was heavily influenced by all these things, but I think she's a good example of like, just what these kind of theosophical ideas did as far as influencing people. Okay, next. So here it is. So Charles Ledbetter was one of the successors of Blavatsky. He was a clairvoyant. He was very interested in Catholic ceremonies. He was a priest before he was a spiritualist, before he was a theosophist. And so he felt that religious ceremonies created these vibrations and that they attracted spirits and so on. And he became interested in incense. So as you see here at the top, there are angels of color who express themselves by kaleidoscopic changes. But there are also angels who live and express themselves by what to us are perfumes and fragrances, though to use such words seems to degrade to materialize the exquisite emanations in which they revel. A subdivision of that type includes the angels of the incense, who are drawn by its vibrations and find pleasure in utilizing its possibilities. Incense is always efficient in attracting the attention of any angels who may happen to be in the neighborhood, which just sounds so funny, like, oh, well, hey, I saw like Gabriel was in the neighborhood, so he came on by. But the idea is that he actually described these, and I don't, the stories of also he used child clairvoyance to observe these things. It's just kind of wild. I'll probably write about it some more on my website. Okay, so next. Okay, so one of his students was this guy, George Aarondale. So George Aarondale his mother died. He was adopted by his Auntie Mame, Theosophist auntie, who was insanely rich. And she gave him all these Theosophist tutors, including Ledbetter. And he wrote this book in 1939. So Ledbetter never really published a lot of his stuff about fragrance, but he did have students who took notes. And so I'm sorry this is so small. I have some of this on the website though. So this theosophical work talks about clairvoyant observations of things. I'll just mention a couple. So the top one is rose. He says that when he observes it, it has a beautiful rose color, not surprising, and it opens up the astral body to love of a high type. So sandalwood is a chord of, here, other places it's red, but he says it's a deep blue, purple, and golden yellow, and it gives devotion of a very high type. It has vibrations that cut and clear away impurities. Too strong of sandal oil, like rose, has a tendency to prematurely open the web between the physical and astral planes. So on my next talk, I'll be talking about this. It's a teaser. So he felt like some fragrances might make you sort of very too clairvoyant, which would be too much for an average person. So he was a little cautious. It would make you, open to the spirit world before you're ready to deal with it. But he spent a lot of time in India, and he definitely has these Indian fragrances or top of a list, like the rose and sandalwood. And then just to pop down to some other things, lavender, he says, is a rainbow, a pale blue violet with touches of rose, which has parallel lines with concentric circles. So that one actually has some shapes and things associated with it. So he studied these, and I probably in the next talk, I'll link in with this a bit. He did have specific incenses he used, and he felt that certain things were appropriate for like meditation and so on, because they created these color atmospheres and called in angels. Okay, next. Briefly, I'm mentioning this because it's mentioned in the Roland Hunt book. So there was this kind of strange scientist who, Edouard Maurer, who was a chemist, who wrote this whole thing in the Occult Review in December 1926. The Music of Perfumes, where he hypnotized people and he had them look at different fragrances and he described what they saw, but they also heard tones and they had all kinds of other things. What's important is this was kind of an influence on this Roland Hunt. And also there are specific mentions in which they looked at synthetic fragrances and they really saw that they had similar colors. They were just slightly different tones. So the next page, I just have a little thing. You can see him hypnotizing people on the right. So he says here, for this purpose, he used geranium, and he put it on this weird olfactometer thing. And then after he hypnotized people, the subject reported that he saw light feathery clouds of crimson that pulsed from crimson to scarlet. So this is actually probably one of the first things from the 1920s where they had an experiment where they actually had people looking at different fragrances and describing, what they saw. Okay, so let me do next because I want to speed through this. Okay, so there is a whole idea that this is just really a type of hypnotism. This person to the left, Sir Alexander Cannon, was this really wacky occult psychiatrist from the UK. He wrote this book in 1936, and he was friends with Roland Hunt. And there's like a little book blurb to the right. He claimed to also use fragrance. He says, I could write a massive tome upon color, sound, and perfume and their hypnotic effects, but the time is not yet ripe. So he actually had this treatment center on the Isle of Man that was like something out of a Hammer horror film. I know way too much about it because as a teenager, I met one of his students who told me like all about it. But he also treated King Edward. He was kind of this famous eccentric. But other people besides this Roland Hunt were using different types of things like this. Cannon, though, specifically said that the reason they worked was because they had a hypnotic effect on people, and that fragrance and color both have a hypnotic effect. Okay, next. Okay, so this is like, I really wanted to talk about this and not totally run out of time. So as you may recall, there are all these name dropping in Roland Hunt's book where he says, and it took me a really long time to find information on this, but he basically says, thank you, Prince Matchabelli. You've really helped me with all of my studies. The book came out in like 37, but Matchabelli had already died like in 35 or 36. And he has, I think some copies of his book had photographs of Prince Matchabelli. So he says that this perfumer, Prince Matchabelli, actually assisted him with these clairvoyant observations. It's really fascinating because this is like one of the only perfumers that I can directly link to this time of being really obsessed with all this metaphysical occult stuff with color. So who was Prince Matchabelli? I mean, people might know these like funky commercials from the 70s about Windsong and so on. I mostly know about him, and I've referenced this. There's a website called Cleopatra's Boudoir by this incredible expert on vintage fragrances, Grace Elizabeth Amon Hummel. And a lot of the history I've gotten is from there, though a lot of the metaphysical stuff is from accounts of his wife, Princess Nerina, as I'll tell you about. So his story is great. He's like a patron saint of the hobby perfumer who becomes famous. So his backstory, he was a real prince, a Georgian prince, who was fascinated from fragrance from a very early age. He came from this very wealthy aristocratic line. They sent him to Berlin where he studied chemistry. And he also said that he studied fragrances in Berlin at the what's now called the Humboldt Institute or University. And then came, you know, the Bolsheviks, and he had to get out. He had been living in Italy where he was working in the embassy there. And that's where he met his wife, who was this famous actress, a silent screen and also a theater actress, Princess Nerina. So they had to move to Manhattan, and he didn't have a lot of money. He only had some money from her that she made from her career. And they opened this boutique in Manhattan that sold luxury goods. But in the meantime, they had the world's most famous friends. Like, she knew every single famous actor and actress. He knew all the crowned heads of Europe. And they would come into the shop and buy things from him. And he had a hobby of making perfume for his friends, and everyone knew this. So people would come in and they're like, oh, Prince George, will you make me a fragrance? So he started making them for all like royalty and famous people. And it became kind of a known thing. And he realized he might make a career out of this. So he apparently had some connections. He went to Paris for a year where he apprenticed with some perfumer, and he came back and he started doing this technically as an artisan thing where he opened a shop. You see on the left, like there he is mixing his perfumes, and he has a lecture on perfumes. So he opened a shop. Let's go to the next slide. They were friends with Cecil Beaton, so he helped design their boutique. He had all these famous people coming to visit, and apparently they pretty much did everything themselves. Like, he blended everything. They had someone design these bottles with the crown, which was apparently his crown. And there's all these stories that he and Nerina like stayed up late at night, like gluing on labels. Like, they did everything themselves in the beginning until they became really rather famous. And then the business really took off, and he got a very special large boutique in New York. Then his business took off in Paris. He opened a boutique, interestingly enough, across the street from Chanel on Rue Cambon. And then he had a boutique on Mid-Wilshire in Los Angeles, until sadly he died kind of young. But what's interesting about him is he had this whole very mystic kind of vibe about him. He and Nerina were known to be really interested in Theosophy and so on. I've tried to find out a little bit more about some perfume things. I have found out some. I've referenced Octavien Coiffon, who's this incredible perfume historian from Paris. So the deal is, according to his wife, who is this incredible mystic who spent most of her life like living with this guru, She said that the prince was actually clairvoyant. She said he was an amateur chemist and he had an amazing ability to smell an astral perfume. So she said he could do like an aura reading and then he just wrote it down as a perfume formula. And that's why he was so popular with these famous people, is because he could do these like soul perfumes for people. Now, I don't think this crossed over into his commercial stuff, but he was really interesting that he was really obsessed with ingredients. He used a lot of very expensive naturals like jasmine absolutes and stuff like that. Just an example, one of the ones he made for his wife, her stage name was Maria. He made Ave Maria, which they described as delicious and mystic. There's all these Oriental references. It is an incense and flower scent. So it has lilies, bergamot, lily of the valley, Persian lilac, Mysore sandalwood, and it has like Abyssinian ambergris, Tibetan musk, and so on. And apparently he did use like real musk and things like that. So he's this fascinating person, an indie perfumer. From what we understand, he and his wife were both really into spiritual things. After he died, she devoted her whole life. She was apparently described as like a psychic and a medium, and she devoted her life to the spiritual teacher, Meher Baba. So the description of the perfume kind of matches her personality, because she basically became devoted to this Indian teacher. Okay, so next, because we're almost done. So I just want to finish up with a couple things. So there have been other people, more recently who've been influenced this. One of the only other people I know who've read this book is the herbalist and aromatherapist, Gina Rose, who she told me that she found it. She started writing in the late 60s, and she's this incredible aromatherapist if you haven't read her stuff. But she said she found Roland Hunt's stuff in the early 70s. And it was influential on her. And she has this chart, which I just have a little chunk of it. I think you can buy it off her website. But she has some associations that are similar. Like here, you can see Sunday is the sun's day. It's orange. And she has like vanilla, citronella, bitter almond, heliotrope. And then some things that don't fit into that. Like she has violet there. So she is someone who definitely was. And she's, I think, the very first person to know that he used the word aromotherapy. And then finally, the most important slide, next. Okay, just so that you know that I stay up with contemporary things. So Brittany, don't ask me how I got Brittany's, this from Brittany, but apparently she posted this on Twitter, or no, maybe Instagram. Some say they smell the fragrances of roses while communicating with angels. Did you know that? I didn't either. Angels use rose scents as a sign of their spiritual presence because roses have energy fields that vibrate at a high electrical frequency, the highest of any flower. So people were like passing this on, like, oh, Brittany is crazy and so on. But in fact, really, she had been reading obviously some sort of esoteric aromatherapy thing, and she was just expressing this kind of practice or thought that like people weren't familiar with. So just to let you know, these things are still contemporary. Okay, I better finish so we can have questions. All right. Oh, my next one will be on psychic incense. This is kind of like a preview. Psychic incense. All right. Okay, I can't talk anymore.
Sure. You always share such a wealth of research and information. It's amazing. I think you pause time and scour the world and come back.
Yeah, I was a little crazy.
No, it's fascinating. So all right. Well, any questions?
I have, I have like mesmerism to Brittany. You can ask any question.
Yeah, you definitely cover the bases. Any thoughts? Any questions or thoughts? Yeah, and no pressure if you don't have any questions or thoughts. I mean, it could be that we just need to process all this amazing information.
Yeah, it was kind of a lot. So, I mean, my thing is that you don't have to believe in metaphysics. I think you can find some of these things to be poetic. Like I find it very poetic, the thought that the sun is crystallizing down. I can tell people they should look at Uncanny Sense, because I didn't really have time to talk about this, but these people were really obsessed also with this perfume yogi, which I mentioned in Uncanny Sense. He was an actual yogi who's mentioned by Yogananda. I don't know if you know, Yogananda was like the first celebrity yogi who settled in LA in the 1920s. He writes about this perfume guru too. And he actually, Yogananda says, oh, these perfumes are vibrations. So he apparently could condense sunlight into perfumes. It was like one of his cities. So it's interesting. They're one of the few people who reference this, which is kind of fascinating as well, because they felt that like fragrance was like, like a sun that had been like congealed into like a crystalline smell. Yeah.
Jasmine's wondering, do you know about the 9 gems in Navratna? It's all about colored gems and colors of the planets.
Yes. So there is a whole Vedic thing of astrology, Indian astrology, Jyotish, and they basically do have their own system of gems that correspond to the planets, and they also have sort of fragrances that go with that. It's slightly different. Like I know, for instance, violet for them is associated with Saturn because it's a dark color, I think, and then they have several other things with gems and so on.
And then Janine is wondering, Joe loves California, and I also love California because all the esoteric stuff, it's all my friends are into it. It's normal for them, which I think is great. So Janine asks, well, was the color scent Ray mentioned briefly the same machine that influenced Luca Turin's studies?
I don't know. It's a good question. I know I didn't really reference him, except that most people here love him and his perfume interests. So for people who don't know, he's the super genius, and most of the scientific establishment does not think that vibration has anything to do with fragrance, but he has a very complex theory that it does. And it's something that would cost like an extraordinary amount of money probably to prove, which like no one's going to do it. But yeah, originally people thought that fragrances were vibration, and he is someone who also thinks that's true.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to guess that the color scent Ray did not influence Luca, because Luca is at the core a very hardcore scientist.
Yes, he is, but he's probably aware that it was in the popular culture. That it
I think he is. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. You're right about that. Yeah. But he was referring to another scientist. I can't remember who it was. I'd have to ask him, but yeah. Okay, any other questions, guys? Or thoughts?
Hey, James. So I think you had mentioned somewhat in passing something about the ideals, or what was it you said? I think you were making a slight reference, but you never really shined a light on it, to Neoplatonicism in a way.
Well,
am I reaching there, or did you? Was I not paying attention? Did you?
Yeah, I can't really unpack like 1,000-page books of Theosophy, but Theosophy was very interesting in that they did. Blavatsky was quite brilliant, and she had a lot of stuff about Neoplatonic teachings,
right?
About these pleromas and all these God coming through all these intermediaries. That was like light coming through lenses and so on. But Theosophy always had their own spin and way of explaining it, and they often changed the lingo and so on. But it would not be too much different from that. But yeah.
Is Theosophy highly influenced by the idea that people are born into the world with certain memories brought over from the idealistic plane, or the ideals, as laid out in some of Plato's arguments?
So yes, because they absolutely believe in reincarnation. So they would normally think that, especially people who are somewhat more spiritually elevated, it had these really exalted past lives, and that they might actually recall some things that happened in this pre-existence, where either they were living before or they were living in this, other world that was, more spiritual and so on.
It's interesting. It's interesting. I wonder, like 300 years from now, when people look back at what Elon Musk is doing, they'll probably look at what he's doing with the same sort of, this guy, he mixed up this and this, and he thought he knew what he was doing. It was just like a mixture of art and science, and interesting, very interesting.
Camille says, I've been studying a lot about the occult lately, and it seems that in spellcraft, the correspondences between color and scent have a lot to do with herbalism and folk medicine. Do you have any insight on that, James? And by the way, I should say we do have to end pretty soon.
Yes, Saskia has to go home to sleep sometimes.
Oh, I'm home and I don't sleep.
I mean, she has to like pet her cat.
Yeah,
Okay,
pet my
so
cat.
yes, so I think I have in the past talked a lot more about herb stuff. So yeah, there's popular witchy stuff where there's lots of things between colors and scents. This is somewhat different. It's a little bit more like high metaphysics, and I kind of just want to go into it because it's not that well known. But yeah, you're absolutely right. So this is fascinating. So muguet, which for people that know is lily of the valley. So as I mentioned, they reference this like muguet shows up as a blue vibration, which would be very spiritual. And it's clearly not a natural. I mean, I can tell you, I only know this from like Octavian Coiffon, but there's never really been a real muguet except once upon a time. Apparently there are these beautiflor things where they use butane to extract some flowers, like it was super expensive, and no one has done it for like 100 years. So whatever they were using was an accord, which means they had naturals and synthetics, things like hydroxycitronellol and so on to give this. So people who are doing spells with muguet are definitely using, synthetics. Occasionally, there are a few naturals that may mimic muguet. That's possible, but yeah, it's not really muguet.
Just to be clear, like, because I'm curious myself, from a sort of how did Camille put it, spellcraft perspective, is there an issue with working with synthetics over naturals? Is there some sort of fundamental problem with that, or?
Well, there's a fundamental problem that aromatherapy, of course, just has this very defined thing that natural fragrances have a high spiritual vibration because they come from plants, and that it can't be reproduced synthetically. However, all these clairvoyants like disagree with them and say like, oh, it is somewhat different, but actually we use Eonone for the violet spiritual treatments, and we don't really have a problem with that, which I think is kind of fascinating, right? And, I've talked about this before, but like, there's hundreds of thousands, if not like millions of people like in South America practicing things like Umbanda and other traditions where they use like Florida water and things that have all kinds of synthetics, and they don't seem to have a real problem.
That's no issue, right?
But
I mean, I know my Cuban family, they work with what they can get, and they do their Santeria and all that stuff.
Yeah, that's all like Florida water. We know that.
Yeah, Florida water, that's right.
Yeah, I have some more details on uncanny scents. And then, like I said, timing to be revealed, I'll do like a psychic incense thing about why incense makes you visionary.
Awesome. Love it. Well, cool. Thank you, James, for your time and the wealth of knowledge that you share with us again. It's incredible.
And maybe I can share more when there's a radio show.
Yeah, it's not public yet. We're launching a radio show in January, everybody. We'll be putting more information online soon. I think we
have to erase that from the recording. It's secret.
No, it's okay. I mean, it's out, just not formal. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, James, you look really cool. You look like a floating genius.
Yeah, this hat is indigo, which is not really a real color except for Newton, remember?
Right. You look like an album cover.
That Queen video where you can
that's it, the Queen video. That's the one, yes.
God bless California, you guys. Stay weird.
Yeah, we do that. We do that with pride.
Yeah. Vancouver.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for your time, everyone.